Hello everyone. This presentation on building effective irrigation return flow treatment system to remove agrochemical is prepared by Damon Abdi, who is an assistant professor of landscape horticulture at Louisiana State University Agricultural Center at Hammond Research Station. I am Sital Paudiel and I will be presenting first 3 slides of this presentation, and then Dr. Damon Abdi will take it from there. So without further ado, let's move on. So what is the difference between runoff water and irrigation return flow? What comes to mind when I talk about runoff water? Basically, most of the people think about a big rain event, like in the first picture, which downpours and then the soil is not able to absorb all the water and then the water runs off or overflows. And that is what we usually think about runoff water. It's hard rain where water doesn't soak into the ground and the water instead flows downhill. Now, what is irrigation return flow? It is very similar to runoff water, but it only occurs in the irrigated areas and it only occurs from irrigation water. So if any irrigation area is receiving too much water that the soil can't soak up and it runs off, that is called irrigation return flow. And the distinction again depends on the situation. So the farm, nursery, heavily irrigated area is irrigation return flow, whereas in urban area, non-irrigated area, which is caused by rainfall, is runoff. But then what about landscape? What about golf course? Again, the distinction depends on how you classify it. If you're applying too much water, and if it runs off, it's irrigation return flow. The distinction depends on situation. So we'll be mostly talking about irrigation return flow in this presentation. A heavy rain or an irrigation event can put down a lot of water. So those water will transport contaminants. So what are the contaminants? Contaminants from agriculture areas can be fertilizer and pesticides. And in lawn and landscape areas, it's fertilizer and pesticide. Urban area, it's wide range of urban pollutants from factories, industry, and things like that. So a heavy rainfall event can transport these contaminants, like heavy metal is one, fertilizer and pesticide again in urban area. In urban area, one unique thing is the irrigation surface is more impervious, meaning there is a lot of concrete, and then the chance of runoff or irrigation return flow is higher and it travels to long distances. These all occur with either runoff or either with the irrigation return flow. So what is the distinction? You can't really help runoff water, like a big rain event. You can't help too much. Of course, you could do some storm water management and other things like that, which is a topic for another time. But you can control the irrigation return flow by changing the irrigation methods, and then you can lower the runoff. But again, in this lecture, Abdi will be talking about how do you deal with the irrigation return flow that's generated. Irrigation return flow has a lot of agrochemical contaminants, a lot of nutrient from fertilizer, pesticide.
And that causes issues for the entire ecosystem within it. We're going to touch on that a little bit more, but when we're talking about nutrients from fertilizer, we're talking about that green algae, we're talking about this eutrophication, and we're not talking about it in a very positive sense. Pesticides, also major issue, right? So of course, with the fertilizer, we're looking at that nitrates and phosphates. Nitrogen and phosphorus is really the stuff that's driving it. But pesticides are also a major issue with it. When we talk about the pesticides that are running off into ponds and into waterways, we're concerned about some of this accumulation of these, right? Especially over a long period of time, as these compounds are getting into the water, they can accumulate and build up in the environment. And what we don't want to see is we don't want to see these negative effects on the ecological environment. We don't want to see sickly animals. We don't want to see anything looking unhealthy for that. And last but not least, we don't want our drinking water contaminated. So that goes without saying. And all of these different kind of contaminants pose their own issues. Look at nitrate. There's standards for, for how much nitrate can be in the water. The drinking water quality standard is, I believe it's 10 parts per million. So you really don't want that in there because it leads to a lot of human health issues, particularly for young children, etc. Same can be said for pesticides. It's not healthy for us. So we want to make sure that we aren't having any issues for the ecosystem or for ourselves. So today, what I'm really going to talk about is some of these methods that we can use to treat some of this water, right? So what can we do to really rectify this issue? So a lot of these slides and a lot of these concepts are going to be based a lot on the environments that I know, Louisiana, things like that, where ponds are very common. It's my understanding that, in Utah, there's limitations on the size of ponds, where you're going to find these ponds. And what I hope to do is to have these principles and practices be able to apply to your area and take it as you will for your site. Now, really looking at a 3-step process for really addressing this issue, we're going to break it down with step 1. We want to clean up the ponds with the surface water, right? We want to get rid of the junk to the extent that we can. And then the second step is we want to identify where this issue is coming from. Removing algae, that's just a band-aid. It's not solving the issue. We need to find where this issue is coming from. And the third step is really addressing the issue at this location and prevent this issue from coming into play again in the future. So throughout this PowerPoint, I'm going to break it down through each of these steps. So when we look at step 1, we're looking at cleaning up the water. Now, there's an easy way, there's a hard way, and there's the realistic way, right? So when we look at physical removal, that is one way. You saw that image about how much algae was out there. So I think it goes without saying, you can imagine how long that might take. So physically removing it is going to help a little bit. Now, there's also removal options with chemicals. Now, myself, I have not sprayed algaecides or done any aquatic spraying. So what I'm going to emphasize most importantly is check the label. If you're going to use these chemicals, check that label and then ensure that you meet whatever local requirements and regulations are in play for you. And then check the label again just for good measure. Originally, I actually had 4 or 5 bullet points saying check the label over and over again, but I think that point is made abundantly clear. So really make sure you do it by the book, make sure you read through things, and then make sure you check it off with people who do that work a lot, just to make sure you're doing it right, because putting chemicals down wrong is something no one wants. So let's avoid that. When it comes to physical removal, we have to do a range of things. Some people might be able to have a little boat that they get out there that they're able to get stuff in. Some people might repurpose some of their equipment and create things that can be able to pull out some of these algae. So it goes without saying, this is very time intensive, very labor intensive. Doesn't use chemicals, so you don't necessarily have to worry about that. You just got to worry about spending all day and a half out there clearing this material out. So something to be said for that. Physical removal is going to remove the algae, but removing the problem, not so much, right? This is just a band-aid solution. You're really treating a symptom without really fighting the overall disease in the sense. But physical removal is going to offer some benefits. Starting out, it's going to make it easier to see the pond, right? You're going to be able to get a better visual of what's going on there, and you might be able to better devise your attack plan when you got a better line of sight. Now, also having less of that debris and less of that material, removing it, it's going to help prevent the clogging of things like fountains, of things like filters, and all that other stuff. It's just going to make it easier to see, easier to manage. But if there's one thing I can emphasize is that is going to be very labor intensive. So that's going to tire you out, and there's not always the practicality in it. Now you can use certain kind of chemicals. I've not sprayed this before. This is just an example of a chemical that I've read some places will use. So going back to it, you want to make sure that you read this label fully. So you'll see keep out of reach of children, keep caution, very, very important. And then if you look at this label, it's going to emphasize some of these environmental hazards, right? So it goes without saying that, you know, certain things for aquatic uses do not apply directly to water except as specified on this label. So if I can't emphasize, if you can take away one thing from me today, it's really read that label. Now, when you're reading a label, and a lot of this is just going to be for general herbicides in general, it's always good to just keep rereading them. It'll tell you which kind of aquatic weeds will be appropriate for control. It'll tell you the application rate, and it's also going to tell you how to apply it based on some of the considerations of your pond, you know, based on how many surface acres it is, how deep that water is. And it's going to give you directions for the proper application. So remember on the last slide, I said do not apply directly to water except as specified. You look through some of these applications and it'll tell you how to do it properly. And this might involve directing the spray through submerged nozzles, things like that, different practices. So really what I'm getting at is that there are tons of regulations, tons of rules for proper use. And not only is it a good idea to follow it, but you're legally obligated to follow it. So make sure you read these labels properly and consult with your local officials to make sure you're doing things right. And when in doubt, don't spray. Really want to emphasize that. So kind of continuing on this, tying back to what I mentioned earlier, when that breakdown of algae happens, those algae and those aquatic plant materials, it's going to consume that oxygen from the water, right? Decomposition is a process that biologically driven is going to take out that dissolved oxygen from the water, right? The thing is, fish need oxygen too. So when these algae and aquatic plants are breaking down and those bacteria are using up all the dissolved oxygen in the water, that doesn't really leave anything for the fish. And when that happens, that's where you're going to see fish kills, right? If you see sudden die-offs of fish, it could very likely just be from lack of oxygen. That's not to say it's, you know, sometimes it's also from pesticides and certainly a combination of the two, but it's important. The reason I mention that is that you want to be good stewards of the environment. You want to take care of that water and you want to be eco-friendly. So be careful not to upset the balance of the ecosystem and follow best management practices. In all reality, when you're really looking at addressing this issue of this eutrophied water body with all this algae, you know, you got to be real and you got to recognize it's probably going to take that combination of chemical and physical, right? So if you look at this image there, how much chemicals would it take to kill off all this algae? I'm willing to bet it would take quite a lot of chemicals. Not only, and that raises you know, a host of issues. First off, stuff isn't cheap anymore. Prices of things are going high, and the more chemicals you have to put down, the more your bill goes up. And that's not even getting into the potential ecosystem ramifications if you're shocking a system with a whole bunch of chemicals. You don't want to do that. So some physical removal may indeed be necessary. You know, it's puts a little dent in it. You get some of that material out, so you won't have to solely rely on chemicals. And, you know, in all practicality, it's probably going to be a little bit of a combination of each, especially if you get to a situation where it's this far off that it needs to be really overhauled. So let's say you are able to physically remove it. Let's say you're able to, you know, put down chemicals, physically remove it, etc. The question is begged, what sustainable practices can help the algae from developing once again? So think about some of the sustainable things you can do. So aerators, right? Aerators are great for ponds. Not only do they add that visual interest, not only do you get that pleasant sound from those fountains going, but it prevents that still water. So by not having that still water sitting there, you're not going to have those mats of algae building up. So it breaks up those mats of algae and you get that nice blue water a little bit. Makes a little bit of a difference. It also adds oxygen to the water. So by adding more oxygen to the water, you're also helping replace some of that oxygen that's being taken up, being consumed in these decomposition practices. And it's also keeping that oxygen there. So all of those aquatic life is doing just fine. So that's step one, we've addressed that. Step two is identifying where the issue is coming from, right? And this is really the opportunity to observe the drainage of the site. So here I've got an image on the left of a nursery. So this nursery, we've got this drainage creek going down there, and we see some hoop houses and stuff way up on the hill there. It's safe to say that water going in here and draining in here has probably got some fertilizers, probably got some pesticides. And we see where that water is going. Image on the right is a neighborhood, right? So a lot of neighborhoods, that water is going to drain off and there's going to be some kind of swale, some kind of culvert where that water is going to go in and run off. And a little pro tip, back in my landscaping days, we'd always go check sites when it was raining. That way we could see where the ponding was occurring, where the flooding was occurring. And especially when we're regrading soil or really trying to make things better that way, it gives us a good idea of where, in fact, that water is going. So you're identifying where this issue is coming from, trying to get an idea of where you're going to attack this issue, which is step three, addressing the issue at the source, strategically implementing a system to address this runoff water where it's going to be the most actionable and beneficial to the environment, right? So in thinking this, we're trying to think of ways that we can intercept runoff water, intercept that runoff water before it gets to retention ponds, or intercept that water and treat it before it continues down a river, before it continues down a creek or anything. So we're trying to intercept that runoff water and cut it off, and then we're trying to remove contaminants. So in terms of intercepting, we're really trying to pre-filter that water before it even reaches the reservoir, before it goes downstream. And a big part of this is going to be removing some of those sediments that are moving in water. So when you think of things like pesticides, certain pesticides and phosphorus, those are going to bind to soils and they stick to soils. But as we all know, erosion happens and that water is going to move some of those soils. So if you can intercept it, give a little pre-filter, you get to trap that before it gets going. And then what we're really trying to do is reduce the amount of these contaminants moving in water, right? We want to remove them. We got to set realistic expectations. How much of these contaminants do we want to remove? How can we go about doing that? So I'm sure you're familiar with a couple different methods for slowing down water, really addressing some of these runoff systems in water. And one method is constructed wetlands. So in this image here on the left is some constructed wetlands. And what you'll notice is you've got a series of these gravel barriers, and then you've got plant material in there. So one might ask, why is this water meandering through this long little path? It's probably getting all slowed down. That's completely by design. By slowing down the movement of water, that's going to allow some of those sediments to settle out. The water's not moving at that speed where it's going to transport very far. So that those solids settle out and that helps there. Plant material is great for it. Those plants are going to take up your fertilizers, right? They're plants, they love fertilizer. So you get some plants there that thrive in those aquatic situations and really rapidly take up N and P, you're good to go. From a management perspective, it doesn't end there though, because that plant material should be harvested and removed. Because what's going to happen when that plant material decomposes? It's just going to release all that nitrogen and phosphorus back down the water. So constructed wetlands, great system in certain ways, But there is some management considerations and routine maintenance that are going to go into that. On a smaller scale, rain gardens function in similar ways. Rain gardens, particularly in areas where you're going to get a lot of rain, such as Louisiana, are a great way for addressing some of that excess stormwater, really trapping some of those sediments, trapping some of those fertilizers, contaminants, and making it aesthetically nice. So you can get these kind of features implemented in landscapes or in certain sites, depending on what it is. So chances are constructed wetlands and rain gardens are things that are not new to you. But something that might be new to you is a bioreactor. And bioreactors is what I spent a lot of time during my PhD researching. So bioreactor sounds like a very, very fancy name, but in fact, it's quite a simple system. If you break down the etymology of the word, bio, short for biological, naturally, reactor, short for reaction. So really, it's just a biologically driven reaction. A wood chip bioreactor now is a lined trench that you often see, and that is filled with wood chips. And these wood chips are a cheap, available carbon source. So we're not using wood chips just because we want to use wood chips. We're using it because it's a carbon source that is available and it's fairly inexpensive. And we can find that pretty much anywhere. So it's cheap and it's available. Most importantly, it's carbon. And then on these wood chips, native bacteria colonize these wood chips. So the bacteria already existing, bacteria need carbon, right? You're just giving them a full feast right there. So they're going to colonize these wood chips. And then what happens is runoff water is going to be passed through these bioreactors. And that way, as it goes through, the bacteria are going to do their treatment on them. So images like this is something that you're going to see throughout the upper Midwest. You know, when you think about the corn and soy regions of America, you know, the breadbasket, you know, the heartland and all that, you got a lot of these row crops there. You got a lot of, you know, agrochemicals that are being put down. So these systems have been around for several decades now and have really been popular up in the Midwest to really deal with that heavy fertilizer movement that you see coming off these croplands. So continuing on that, it's really that bacteria that drives it. Those are the superstars in this. So these bacteria populations, you've given them plenty of carbon, right? They're living real good. They're colonizing it, developing these thick biofilms on that because they need that carbon to live. Now, bacteria also need that nitrogen and that phosphorus. So in essence, what you've basically done is create a situation where you're providing these bacteria with everything they need to thrive. This image right here is from some of my small scale bioreactors that I was researching on. And something that we really see come out of it is this huge growth in life. So you can see the bubbles, that gas as these bacteria are respiring, that's pushing out all this gas there. And you see how it's just teeming with this bacterial life. So these bacteria are capable of degrading, transforming, and removing certain contaminants as they go through. We got this very robust population in there that's just super active, and they're going to take care of a lot of these contaminants. The wood chips itself are also capable of absorbing contaminants, right? So we know that certain pesticides are more likely to bind and stick to living matter, organic matter. They're going to stick to it. They don't have much of affinity for dissolving water. They want to stick to that organic matter. Last time I checked, wood chips are organic matter. So wood chips can certainly absorb some of these contaminants. So just going into some detail a little bit about some studies that I did back when I was in Michigan State. We did some lab scale studies looking at small scale bioreactors in those gray bins there. So rather than a big lined trench in a field that you might see, we did these in these small bins, right? And what we did is we created this simulated runoff. We didn't have runoff from a farm that we collected. We made our own, right? And this simulated runoff, we mixed up some fertilizers, some pesticides into a bucket and injected them into each of these bioreactors. So this is under the hood of one of those bioreactors. So we supply this water to them, and we keep this contaminated water in these treatment systems for a period of time. Several studies were done looking at times as short as 20 minutes, times as long as 3 days. So we looked at a pretty good range. You supply this contaminated water in, let it sit, let it marinate in these bioreactors for a bit, and then we sampled this water and analyzed it after treatment. So my crude little animation here, if you can imagine, is this is our bin with some little wood chips in it. Now on these wood chips, we get all these bacteria thriving, right? So it's carbon, they're living life, they're happy, they're having a good old time. Now enter some of these agrochemical contaminants, enter that nitrate, enter that phosphate, right? So the bacteria need this to survive. So as these contaminants are moving through these systems, what's going to happen is that phosphorus is going to be accumulated by the bacteria, right? They're going to use that for their own life sources. They're going to use it and they're going to kind of sequester it. That nitrogen, that's going to be the interesting stuff. So nitrogen, we all know how active that is in the environment, how much it's going to cycle, how it changes between forms very, 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 very readily. So when you've got nitrate in these water systems, very soluble form of nitrogen, what we want to do is we want to get that out. So nitrate, how do we get that out? One option is denitrification. Denitrification is the reduction of nitrate all the way down to dinitrogen gas, or N2. When you keep nitrate in anaerobic conditions where there's not plenty of oxygen, the bacteria are going to use that nitrate in their respiration process. And what that does is it reduces it sequentially to several intermediates, but the final step, and hopefully we get to that final step, is to get it to N2 gas. That N2 gas, that dinitrogen gas, just gases off into the atmosphere. Oh, by the way, 78% of the atmosphere is dinitrogen gas, so that's not really a problem. The treatment doesn't go on long enough, you'll get some kind of intermediate gases, some greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, etc. We don't want that. So really about letting it treat for a certain amount of time. But as you can see, these bacteria are powerhouses for transforming these chemicals, these contaminants, and putting them into a more desirable form. Just as importantly, getting them out of the water. When you look at pesticides, you can very generally group them as either soluble pesticides or insoluble pesticides. So your soluble pesticides, things that are going to dissolve readily in water, those are going to move right through that water and run off, right? And as it moves through, some of those bacteria are going to start to chew those pesticides up. And as it passes through, it just gets less and less, right? Your less soluble pesticides, as I mentioned, they have an affinity for binding to organic matter, where what you'll often see is they're going to bind to these wood chips. And when it's bound to the wood chips, what's going to happen is that bacteria there, that's going to have a chance at really degrading them over time. So those wood chips are physically stuck, or the contaminants physically stuck to the wood chips, and the bacteria are having at it. Over time, it breaks down. Now that begs the question, how long does water need to be in a bioreactor? Well, the term for the length of time that water is going to spend within a treatment system is the hydraulic retention time, or simplified for the HRT. What this basically comes down to is how long or how short you let that water sit in these bioreactors. Now, the longer you have it treat, that's more time for bacteria to degrade contaminants, right? Those bacteria are going to have access to break it down, and sooner or later, it's going to degrade substantially. It's also more time for that contact between the contaminants and the wood chips, and to help foster some of that binding that can occur. Now, the trade-off is, if you let water sit in there for super long, you're not going to treat a whole large volume of water. If you let water go through super fast, you're going to get a little bit of treatment, and maybe not as much as you want, but you'll treat a very, very large amount of water. So these are some trade-offs you have to consider. There is such a thing as letting water sit in treatment for too long. You know, if you let water sit in these treatments for too long, then the bacteria are going to consume everything in it. They'll consume all the nitrates. Then what are they going to do? They'll move on to sulfur. They'll move down the line, and then you can have some bad things happen if water sits in there too long. So really, as a synopsis, what you're really looking at in what's probably your first crash course in bioreactors is that, quite simply, it's a trench of carbon. It doesn't have to be wood chips, but wood chips are commonly used because they're available, they're cheap, they're easy to find. The nitrates biologically changed to dinitrogen gas, right? So you're removing those nitrates by gassing them off and sending them up into the sky. Soluble pesticides, those may move freely. They're dissolved in the water, but those may also be degraded by bacteria as they pass through. Less soluble pesticides, those are likely to stick to the wood chips, and those could also degrade over time, so they'll bind and stick. The big thing from my research was that contaminant removal is going to depend on treatment time, how long you're going to have water sitting in there. So you can get pretty substantial nitrate removal in 1 to 3 days. In publication and water research, we got about 99% nitrogen removal from 90 parts per million to less than 0.2 parts per million nitrate in 72 hours in that 3-day span. The less time you have, you'll still get treatment, but it won't be as complete. Pesticides removal can be very rapid. I mean, it can be in a matter of hours to several days. And that's really going to depend on, are these pesticides going to be chewed up, degraded, decomposed by the bacteria, or are they sticking and physically stuck in the wood chips? It's going to depend, but the removal is going to depend on treatment time in a lot of ways. So that's some insights into bioreactors. So I talked about the work that I did in the lab with these lab scale bioreactors, but also I put in some field scale bioreactors. So this field scale project, this is where me and Chantel, Dr. Pudyal, got to know each other very, very well. We was working out there at the horticulture farm during our time at Michigan State, working on how can we implement recycled water into nurseries. I worked on the water treatment side, and he worked on seeing if that recycled water is suitable for the plant. So from our two angles, we collaborated to really get some cool stuff going. So you'll notice these boxes here are a little bit bigger than those bins that I had in the earlier image. So we had big bioreactor boxes. We had a pond liner in it, so it's not too far off from those trenches. These bioreactors were all plumbed together. And what happened is we had a pond from a nursery. And this pond collected all the runoff from this nursery we had. So there's tons of fertilizer and pesticides in this. So we take this dirty water, this contaminated runoff water, and then we supplied these to these field bioreactors. So these field bioreactors gave it some treatment. And then afterwards, that cleaned water was then sent to irrigate the plants. And the results of the study was published in Water, Air, and Soil Pollution last year. And this really showed a good synopsis about recycled runoff for nurseries. There's the reference for it. And Dr. Pudyal led that. I helped out in the bioreactors there, and we had a great team working all together. And the big thing that we found is that bioreacted treated water, recycled water, can certainly have some benefit in a irrigation system for nurseries. And as a quick diagram here, what you'll notice is that we had this main nursery here. with all that runoff water getting collected to a pond, pumped to these treatments, and then in Dr. Pudyal's area, he compared using raw groundwater with that contaminated runoff coming straight off this nursery with the bioreacted treated water. And he evaluated seeing how different plants perform under these different water quality considerations. So some really unique stuff, really interesting stuff, and I'm sure he'll talk more about that. But what I'd like to do to kind of tie it all up is talk about just big picture things. So if you're looking at creating a healthier pond, you're trying to create a healthier water management, think about those aerators. That's going to circulate water too. But maybe add in a little bioreactor as well. An intake pump in the pond, then pumps water to a bioreactor back into the pond. And this offers you control over the treatment time, and it might make a little bit of a difference. So just some ideas of how you could potentially implement that. And with that, that's where I'm at there, and I'd like to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Dr. Abdi, for the wonderful presentation. Josh, thanks for coming in as a panelist. If you don't know Josh and I are a team for this grant, for water recycling grant that we have. And through this grant, we are running this webinars, and we are also building some demonstration site in Utah, which our participants will have opportunity to visit and see how it works or see if it works. But then this was a wonderful presentation, and yes, the water treatment are a really good answer to if we have a lot of pesticides or agrochemicals in runoff water. If we are not using much chemicals, recycling water might do well, but if we have a lot of chemicals, or if we are above the environmental limit, then the treatment is a really good option, which Dr. Abdi talked about well. If you have any questions, feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We have one question here. It says, as the wood chips break down, do you pull them out and replace them in the bioreactor? If yes, how often do they need to be replaced?
So that is a great question. So the question is, what kind of maintenance do you do with these wood chip bioreactors? And if so, how often? So as these wood chips are being broken down by the bacteria, right, they're degrading. And in a long term, you're going to see that trench, it's going to start getting shallower and shallower. Now that's going to happen over the span of years. You're not going to see that very frequently. You don't need to remove those wood chips, right? They're going to just break down. What you would do, good management practice would just be adding in more wood chips. So you just kind of top dress it. You just keep adding it in. So it's not removal necessary. You just add it in. And by having those existing wood chips there, they're teeming with biological life. That's going to really inoculate and serve to keep feeding that population there. So it's pretty low maintenance in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Do you keep the wood chip covered or open?
That's a great question. So these systems, you can keep them covered. You can even implement these systems underground if you're limited on space. So a lot of times what you'll see is, in certain areas, maybe in big farms, you might see them with open air, and that gas is just going to go straight up in the air. You can cover it if you're implementing these systems, and then you're putting, let's say you're a nursery and you don't want to take space out of production. You can build these systems underground and then have a cover over the top so you're not losing space. That being said, though, if you are going to cover it, keep in mind that these bacteria, they're going to be sending off these gas emissions, this dinitrogen gas, all these other gases. So you want to make sure that there's some vent, some air, so that way you don't have this gas buildup under there. That's just not going to be good. So you can cover it. It doesn't need the sunlight, doesn't need any of that, but it's going to depend on your operation. But just make sure it's got space for that gas to gas off.
So the follow-up question I think is it on a valve for output flow of water then? Is it on like so? Yep.
So it's going to depend, and it all depends on, how you install it and what kind of system you're in. So imagine, you're in a big farm and this is, hundreds of feet, hundreds of meters of a bioreactor there. You're likely probably going to have some kind of weir or some kind of levee, some kind of dam that you're going to be able to control flow rates to get, to raise a gate, lower a gate, and control the flow rates. That's one option. You could just let it naturally flow through and not really monitor the flow rate. That's an option. You lose the control over it, but that's another thing there too. A lot of these installations, what they do is they're designed so that runoff water in a heavy rain event is going to go pass through them. But let's say you get a huge rain event and you got a lot of water, there's a bypass there. So once those bioreactors are full, that excess water is just going to go through a separate pipe and drain out there. You don't get to treat it, but you're not going to backlog it up. So it's really going to come down to the engineering and the purposes of what you're trying to implement it to for your location.
Awesome. That's a really nice answer. And Christina says it's a comment, great information and presentation, very doable system, it seemed like. And I think it's very doable, right? You can scale it up to any capacity that you want, from a small to really large.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of opportunities for it, and how you scale it, how you operate it, how long you treat for it. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox to be able to implement it in a way that's most affordable and efficient for you. And I really appreciate the opportunity and the kind words to be here. Me and Dr. Pujol go way back, and it's a pleasure to be invited to work alongside with him and talking about this. And he's great to work with, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and if any of you know any nursery or anyone trying to build this bioreactor, Dr. Damon Abdi or I would be happy to work on the project along with you and provide some feedback, suggestion, anything like that. We are out there for that.